Good morning, and thank you for being here. Allow me to introduce myself. My name is Brenda Nadjiwan, and I am a member of the Chippewas of Nawash First Nation, a place called Cape Croker, about 40 miles north of Owen Sound. That's where my dad and his dad came from. His mother, though, came from Shawniga near Parry Sound, and his grandmother on his father's side came from Wassac Sing, a small island community near Parry Sound. My mother, however, came from Serpent River, about 70 miles west of Sudbury, along Highway 17, which is where her mother came from. But her father came from a place called Wequemacong, in the large island community of Manitoulin Island. The distance between my parents' communities represents about an 8-hour driving trip, a daunting excursion back in the day, so you're probably wondering how they met. Well, they met at residential school in a place called Spanish Ontario, also along Highway 17. My dad became friends with my mother's brothers, and because he was so far away from home, they felt sorry for him, and so would often take him home to their home about 8 miles down the railroad tracks for long weekends. And it was here that he and my mom got to know each other, let's say, very well. And that is how I arrived here today. I like to talk about where I come from. All Native people do. Telling each other where we come from is what opens the door to our connections to one another. It allows us to honor relationship and environment, and for many Aboriginal people, one enhances the other. Environment situates us in terms of family and community, cultural heritage and language, and above all, the original instructions of our ancestors. The expression stewards of the environment means not only care and concern of the land, but care and concern of all those teachings with which that land is associated. It is about our ongoing relationship to those teachings. It is about feeling connected and staying connected. I believe the further we get away from our connection to seeing things in a related way, the further we get away from whom we are meant to be, and the further we get away from having a meaningful relationship with one another. I like to think of environment, though, as the here and now. Sometimes we share environments with many, as in this room, sometimes few, as in our homes, sometimes somewhere in between, as in our places of work. So I'm here today to discuss just that, our relationship to one another as it relates to the creation of our work environment, and define mutual areas of care and concern of the shared environment of the workplace. But before I go any further, I should say thank you to the spiritual guidance that has come into this room this morning, and I humbly ask for help to speak together in a good way, a way that will make our ancestors proud. When I first started working for Aboriginal Affairs, my boss used to always wonder why I was hugging and kissing so many people who came through the front office. Well, it was because they were all related. Well, most of them. In fact, if you come from anywhere around the Georgian Bay and you're Anishinaabe, chances are you and I are related. So the first question I have of you this morning is, do I have any relatives out there? Oh, hi, cuz. Okay. I contend that if you put two Aboriginal people in the same room, we are going to find a way to be related. Why? Because relationship is important to us. And in a way, it is sort of my day job to make sure that when I do speak at various events, that I continue to see more and more of my relatives in the audience. In terms of the job I do, I coordinate the Aboriginal Workforce Participation Initiative for the Ontario region. Its mandate is to increase Aboriginal people in the workforce. Like any daunting task, it has steps. The first is to create and increase awareness about Aboriginal employment issues and business opportunities. The employers I work with are very much like those of you in the audience here today, very knowledgeable and very sophisticated. They, like you, already know about our demographics. Employers as businesses know how this relates to us as a viable labor supply. they also understand these numbers as it relates to us as potential consumers. So I'm imagining that you're like any other employer that I work with, and you do not need to be persuaded to hire us. You understand the business case. Employers often do, however, need to understand issues that affect their employability. Most employers, like yourselves, are informed about Aboriginal people through the media. High suicide rates, teen pregnancy, hunting and fishing rights, treaties and land claims, health and education. You read about it all the time, and in some ways, it informs the basis of the relationship you have with the Aboriginal community, and not always in a good way. You can't trick me. I know, because I read the same newspapers. So my job, in part, is to help employers unlearn and relearn about the Aboriginal community, but it's mostly to assist in identifying practical measures of response to these issues within the context of improved employment participation. That's a mouthful. So let me just summarize this point by saying this. Aboriginal people are so much more than what you read about in the newspapers. You know what the hardest thing about working for Aboriginal Affairs is? At the end of the day, I can go home and stop being an employee, but I can never go home and stop being an Aboriginal person. And all of this is to say that what is in the news not only affects how many employers feel about Aboriginal people, but it also affects how we feel about ourselves. So I would like to take this opportunity to also remind my relatives out there too that we are so much more than what we read in the newspapers. Believe it. The second objective is to identify and enhance networking opportunities. This equates to helping employers find potential Aboriginal candidates, or in some cases businesses, with whom to subcontract through partnership development. In that we're growing 6 times faster than the non-Aboriginal population, I find this not a little mystifying. Aboriginal people are everywhere. If you have an office in Thunder Bay, you would know that you are just down the road from one of the most accessible First Nations in Ontario, being Fort William. And the more established your relationship is with the Aboriginal Employment and Training Action Circle here in Thunder Bay, the less work for me. So thank you. The third and final objective is to build capacity amongst employers to increase Aboriginal recruitment, retention, and advancement. There's a lot of competition out there for the Aboriginal employee, and employers come to see me to strategize around ways to becoming an employer of choice. They want ideas to entice Aboriginal people into their organization, and then ideas of how to keep them there. Relationship and environment relates to all these areas. So how do you do it? How, as an organization of business, do you create a relationship that enhances your environment and an environment that enhances your relationship? In that there's a certain subjectivity to this phrase, I always like to first suggest that you involve the subjects. That is, involve your Aboriginal employees if you have any. But involve other employees as well, like union and social groups, and of course management. Yes, management. No matter how egalitarian you like to think your organization is, my experience is that increased Aboriginal participation requires a top-down approach. Senior managers are the ones who are responsible for committing the human and financial resources. And it will take resources, because when it comes to relationship, there's a lot of work to be done. Nevertheless, have employees participate in defining what makes their environment relationship friendly, and then have them design a strategy to address that. Make that strategy a company policy. Employers who do well with recruitment and retention of Aboriginal employees don't just talk about these things. They have concrete documentation to which they can refer when things go off the rails. They have goals that are attainable and measurable. So at the end of the year, they can evaluate their plans for effectiveness and redress any areas that are getting them to where they want to be. Some have formalized agreements. This leads to another important question. Where do you precisely want to be as it relates to Aboriginal participation in your workforce? What is your vision of the perfect workplace? My vision of the perfect workplace is a place where everyone enjoys coming into work every day. Okay, so enjoy may be too strong a word, but no one should have to come into any workplace with dread and wonder what horrible event is going to beset them today. You no doubt have harassment and racism-free policies in place, but these should be the very minimum. How do management and union groups make sure these things are not happening in their workplace? Well, they check the reports. Any reported incidences? Nope. So now everyone can sit back and imagine that the workplace is harassment and racism-free. Well, if this is so, how come retention rates suffer to the extent they do? My feeling is that issues of harassment and issues of racism exist because they are just not being reported. And this is because so much of what goes on is subliminal. Consider the issues around education, for example. Education is probably one of the most important equalizing forces of any. No one ever complained when many of us were confined to residential school, and no one blames Aboriginal people for that. But in the here and now of today's budgetary constraints, one might complain about the money being spent on Indian education. As I said, education is an equalizing force, so one has to wonder what underlies this complaint. I sometimes wonder if education would do well to educate people not only to think, but to think about why we think the way we think. It would be so easy if people just came up and said, "I hate you because you're an Indian." That clearly spells out one's options. The employee can report it, or if that person were me, I could choose to deal with it. And in my true counseling background way, I would suggest we talk. Yeah, that would teach them. But I like talking. Can you say that about all people? Would you say this about an Aboriginal employee in particular? Remember, Aboriginal people are relatively new to your organization, and it's difficult to know to what extent we should be rocking the boat, or in this case, talking the boat. Most employers know there is a law. Most employees know there is a law, but many will not always know the extent of its protection. Aboriginal employees are no different. And many Aboriginal employees will have been subjected to racist comments before, and sometimes see it as the norm more than the exception. In other words, it has become the status quo. In other words, we're used to it. That doesn't mean that it won't hurt. It just means that when we've had enough, we leave, which of course speaks to the importance of companies having an exit interview strategy. Policy will reduce overt and systemic racism, but I believe the real problem can be solved through collaborative relationship, which is all about communication. And this leads me to what I think needs to happen next. An environment of collaborative relationship is not created solely by policy.